Good evening. I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to my internet show. This is July 15th, and tonight I want to talk to you about the whole concept of the welfare state, the warfare state, what it involves, what it is entailed in this paradigm in which we've all been born and raised, in which we've all been taught is freedom, and compare it to the libertarian paradigm, where we would be living in a society that wouldn't have a military empire, wouldn't have all these bases overseas, wouldn't have the welfare state, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and so forth. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about the ramifications of those two paradigms. Now, it's kind of interesting because, we libertarians believe that our paradigm is genuine liberty. And ironically, the statists, conservatives and liberals, who both support the welfare state and the warfare state, they consider their system freedom too. And that's interesting because you've got here two opposite systems. You've got a system where the government takes money from people and gives it to other people through force, and then has a military empire that's funded by tax revenues, that is extended all over the world, and gets the United States into all kinds of resentments and anger and hatred and so forth on the part of foreigners. And you've got torture and assassinations and indefinite incarceration, essentially military control over the citizenry under the guise of this inane war on terrorism, that's supposed to go on forever and ever. Well, if you take all of this, the welfare and the warfare, conservatives and liberals call that freedom. And part of it's self-delusion, where they just delude themselves. And they say, oh, well, we're going to convince ourselves freedom because America is freedom, and everybody knows America is freedom, and they were taught in their public government schools and their government licensed schools that this is a free country as compared to, Cuba and North Korea and China and so forth. And and part of it's just the life of the lie, where they just convince themselves that serfdom is freedom, serving the greater good of the collective and being made to do so on pain of fine and imprisonment, that this is freedom. But what's interesting about this is that we libertarians stand for a completely opposite system. I mean, we stand for the dismantling of the things that they consider as freedom. And that's fascinating because, you see, if a person believes he's free, if he honestly believes he's free, either through, a self-induced lie or a delusion, then he has very little incentive to break his shackles. Johann Goethe, the great German thinker, he really summed up the plight of conservatives and liberals in America today when he said, none are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free. And that is the conservative and liberal problem, is that they consider life in America today to be free. I mean, you can hear it when they say, we're proud of the troops for, being in Afghanistan, Iraq, and sanctioning Iran, and having, the military in North Korea and Africa and Latin America, because the troops are defending our freedom. Well, by that they mean we're free here. And why are we free in the eyes of the statists? Because we live in a welfare state, because we have Social Security, we have Medicare, the government takes care of us, it has Medicaid, it makes us good, it makes us caring, it forces us to share with our neighbors or with our parents or with whomever needs the money. I mean, foreign dictators, that's part of welfare. Right now, Secretary of State Clinton is in Egypt, and she just proposed another $1 billion offer from U.S. taxpayers, to stimulate the economy. Now, this is on top of the $1.5 billion that the U.S. government already gives, and out of that $1.5 billion, $1.3 billion goes to the military dictatorship in that country. Now, she's over there saying, we don't take sides in these elections. This is nonsense. Of course they take sides. They're taking the side of the military dictatorship. That's where the $1.3 billion in cash and weaponry go to? I mean, they don't even make the check code payable to the new president or to the dissolved parliament. See, all legislative powers now rest in the military. I mean, they control the court, so the court has dissolved the parliament, and so the military says, well, you have to obey the courts. But they control the courts. And it's a classic military dictatorship. It's like Pinochet's dictatorship. And that money is going to fund those generals and to give them weaponry that they can then use to maintain order and stability if people try to resist the military dictatorship and say, we don't want a military dictatorship in Egypt anymore. But you see, that's part of the welfare. And so it's not just Social Security and Medicare. In fact, the entire military apparatus, the gigantic military industrial complex, which is what President Eisenhower called it, all the contractors, the subcontractors, all the people that thrive off this gigantic military edifice, that's part of the welfare system. Now, it's military welfare, but it's really no different in principle from the domestic welfare, because you see the money is all taken out of the private sector and distributed to the government sector, to the dole sector. And that's what a lot of people don't realize. They say, oh, well, yeah, but government officials pay taxes. Well, they don't really. They are the recipient of tax revenues that are taken from the private sector, because it's only the private sector that can sustain the government sector. That's the only way the government gets its money. If you had no private sector, there would be nothing to give or pay the government sector. So you always have the private sector first, and then they extract income or wealth from that to fund the welfare state section, or as we call it sometimes, the warfare state section. But it's really just one gigantic government welfare system, because it all is dependent on the private sector. Now, notice something interesting here, that for the last several years, maybe decades, the government has been spending more in welfare, domestic and military, than it has brought in tax revenues, right? I mean, we all know that. That's like, everybody knows that now. That's what the big debt ceiling debate is about, where to make up the difference, they've gone out and borrowed the money, and they keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing until they finally get so much debt that the Congress says, okay, that's it, no more debt. And but then when that ceiling comes along, they say, okay, a little bit more debt won't hurt. And you see it just, remember when the debt ceiling was raised, I don't know, a year and a half ago? And they said, oh, we have to do this, there'll be a default, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? And they do this every time, especially the mainstream statist media, all the horrible things. But from then till now, when the new debt ceiling is going to be reached, have you seen any of them saying, you know what, we were lucky that people went along with raising that debt ceiling, so we need to slash spending so that the tax revenues equal the spending? No. In fact, it's the opposite. All the statist mainstream press says, keep spending, keep spending, keep spending, in the hopes that it'll stimulate the economy. Now, why is this so important? Well, because it shows you the mindset of the statists. That everything is oriented, our entire lives since birth are oriented toward sustaining the welfare state. I mean, that's the goal of the welfare state, to sustain it, to support it. I mean, we all work to sustain the welfare state. That's the goal of life. Now, okay, you may have your own individual pursuits and so forth, but they're all trumped by the sustaining of the welfare state. Now, in a sense, we're living in a giant beehive, okay? I mean, that's the way to look at it. And we're all the drones that are working, okay? We all have our jobs and we all make money, but well, some people have their jobs, a lot of them are unemployed, but the whole objective is to get everybody working together and working, employed, full employment, in order to, not just so that they can, have a nice life for themselves. No, That's not the objective. The objective is to get the economy going in order to support and sustain the welfare state, including the military empire. And so when they talk in terms of, well, we got to stimulate the economy, we got to get people back to work, notice that they are not slashing any government spending at all. I mean, really, suppose your family is out spending, $100,000 on income of $25,000, and you just go to the bank and you say, I want to borrow $75,000 different. So the bank lends it to you. You're now in debt $75,000. The next year you do the same thing. You're now in debt $150,000. Next year you do it again, and you keep doing this till all of a sudden you owe $1 million in debt, and you got $25,000 income. Well, the bank all of a sudden says you can't even make your interest payments. I mean, we're not going to lend you any more money, and at that point you're busted. I mean, I would say, well, you need to slash expenses here, right? You need to get your expenses down to $25,000, or actually less, so you can start paying back that principal. They're not doing that. They're mounting the debt. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and their only hope is putting people back to work in order to pay the taxes that will then fund the welfare warfare state, and happy days will be here again, at least with respect to statism. And so that's their mindset, that everybody exists as a drone to support the welfare state. And it's important that we recognize that, because it's not freedom. This is the power of the collective, where you exist to serve the greater good of society. You exist to serve the greater good of the collective, the welfare state, the warfare state. They have a right to exist. Okay? You see the same mindset, by the way, in Egypt. This is why the U.S. government is funneling, $1.3 billion every year. They've done it for years. That's U.S. taxpayer money. If there was ever a place you could say, well, let's slash spending $1.3 billion, it would be here. Because here's money going to a military dictatorship that has said, we are the foundation of society. You will understand, this is what the Egyptian military says. They say to the president, your powers are dependent on what we give you. The legislature does what we're told. If they don't, we dissolve it. The courts will sustain us. In other words, the military says, we are here permanently. We are the foundation. We control the taxes. We control the tax revenues. We control the budget. Okay? They're the permanent, and then everybody exists to support them. And right now they're talking, Secretary Clinton was over there, how can we stimulate the economy? Well, you've got this huge, government sector. You got the military actually running hotels and other industries. Nobody really knows the extent of it because it's national security. They got the same national security stuff that we have over here. And their national security secrets won't permit them to disclose what the military is involved in, their businesses and how much everybody's making and so forth, because they're the power source. And so what they're telling the Egyptian people essentially is, you live for us. You get out there and work, and we're going to stimulate the economy, and the United States taxpayer is going to send another $1 billion over here. You guys need to get back to work to sustain us in the military, because we're permanent, but we thrive off the private sector. And so you need to get out and work so you can send us the tax revenue so we can expand and so forth. That's exactly the mindset as the welfare warfare state over here. That it's permanent. That there's nothing Americans can do about it. That it's here forever. And that's the idea they inculcate in young children. That's what the government-approved schools are all about. Public schools, the government licensed private schools. They have to teach this notion that America's free, America's exceptional, because it is free, and the welfare state is freedom, and the warfare state and the empire is freedom. Because they inculcate new generations with this delusion and this lie. And of course, they look at us libertarians and they really don't like us. Because, we're like therapists. We confront people with reality. We say, this isn't freedom at all. This is serfdom. I mean, this is a sophisticated form of slavery where the government has essentially nationalized everybody's income. They can set whatever percentage they want. They can make it 10%, 40%, 80%. You know, I mean, I find it interesting when I hear young people say, you know, they're great lamentation. Not all of them, because there's a lot of young people that are now libertarians. They've broken through and they realize this stuff. But a lot of the young people, it's so interesting to hear them say, golly, there's not going to be Social Security when I grow up. Oh, woe is me. Well, of course there is. There's no problem. All you have to do when you get to be 60 is continue taxing your children. You know, okay, you don't have children now? All right, you will. And your friends will. And you can start taxing them, and then they're going to have children, grandchildren. You just tax them. Take their money. What's the problem? All right, I mean, okay, the situation might be bad. You might have to tax them 80% of their income in order to sustain your retirement. But hey, so what? They did it to you, and you got a right to do it to them, right? I mean, that's going to be the mindset. It's the mindset of my generation. The dead people are gone. They did it to me. I now have a right. I have a right to do it to the young people of this country. And that's what Social Security is. It's a straight confiscation from the young and the productive in order to fund the retirement, the senior years of the elderly. And you know, we all live under the, well, not all, but a lot of people live under this self-delusion, this lie of, oh, there's a fund and they put my money away and I know it's in a lockbox and I'm just taking back what belongs to me. No. I mean, let's just call it like it is. You know, it's based on taking money from the young and the productive, many of which are having a heck of a hard time, you know, raising a family and so forth financially, and they got to send all this welfare money to Washington because, you see, we all work for the state. We work to sustain the welfare state. Well, let me talk a little bit about what libertarianism is all about here. You know, libertarianism would dismantle the whole welfare state. Okay? Now, people say, oh, Jacob, that's just pie in the sky. That could never happen. What do you even talk about it for? And conservatives especially say this, because conservatives spend their time trying, and their efforts and their energy and their lives to figuring out ways to make the welfare state work. I mean, you see this in the healthcare debate. You know, you see where you can always tell a conservative by his plan. You know, it's a, you know, whether it's medical IRAs or tax subsidies to the taxpayers, or, you know, wage and price controls on the doctors, or whatever the plan happens to be. That's a conservative. You see, because a conservative accepts the existence of the welfare state, Medicare, Medicaid, occupational licensure, regulation, and then he comes up with his plan as to why this whole thing should work. Well, he's no different from any other statist. You know, they're never going to make it work. I mean, that's what we libertarians realize. You cannot make socialism work. It's just impossible. All you end up with is a bigger crisis. And sure, there's a healthcare crisis. Why wouldn't there be? You got Medicare, you got Medicaid, you got government licensure. I mean, whenever government's paying for things, there's going to be costs are soaring out the gazoo. Why? Because people are cheating. Whenever people see a chance to filch a little bit of money from the government, they're going to do it. I'm not saying everyone does it, but enough people do it. They say, well, if, you know, might as well take my share. I mean, it's what the welfare state's based on anyway, right? Okay, so they commit a little bit of fraud. You know, the doctor doesn't really show up at that patient's bed. He sends in a bill as part of the Medicare bill. You know, he's just getting his share back, is his rationale. He's paid taxes all his life. And so, you know, we libertarians would dismantle all this. That's how you can know a libertarian from a conservative or a liberal. We're not interested in reforming the welfare state. On the warfare side, you know, we would dismantle all those overseas military bases. You know, there's like 1,000 of them in 150 countries or so. I mean, imagine if those 150 countries had military bases over here, and their troops could walk around and do things and be immune from them. And, you know, let's say they rape some American girl, and the U.S. courts wouldn't have jurisdiction. They could go back to their military, and their military would protect them. a kangaroo trial and slap them on the wrist and so forth. I mean, Americans would resent that. I mean, in fact, it was kind of humorous when the president of Ecuador, when he was closing the U.S. military base there, a military base that the U.S. said, oh, this national security requires this base and so forth. And he said, get out of here. Unless you let Bolivia, it was Ecuador. Unless you let Ecuador have a military base there in Miami, I think it was Ecuador. It could have been Bolivia, but the principle's the same. I mean, people don't like the military forces, foreign military forces in their lands. We wouldn't. And yet here we are, having a military all across the world. I mean, this is how the U.S. government establishes friendships. I mean, they see China going out giving money. Now, from a libertarian standpoint, well, we don't buy that. It's just public money. It's welfare. I mean, China's going into Latin America giving welfare, government to government aid. Same thing like the U.S. government does with Egypt and Jordan and these other, dictatorial countries. But it's public money, it's government money. But to respond to this, the U.S. empire says, oh, well, we're going to send warships to make friends with people. So they're going into Vietnam. Imagine Vietnam, the country that whose communist regime killed some 60,000 American men, and now our warships are over there saying, we want to be friends with you because we have a rival forming. A rival? Oh, and that's the empire think. That's how they think as empires. That's how the Roman Empire thought. That's how the Soviet Empire thought. They look at the world in terms of rival powers that are coming to threaten the empire. And so in Laos, they're over there trying to make friends with that communist government. And of course, they go over there and visit. And when Clinton went over there, they talked to her about all the bombs that are still killing and maiming people, including children, left over from the illegal secret war during the Vietnam War against Laos. They dropped those little bombs that are colored that explode into like 1,000 bombs. They're still around. There's like thousands of them. And they still injure people and kill people to this day. Well, but you see, my point is that that's how the warfare state thinks in terms of establishing friendships. We would dismantle it all. In fact, if you want to see the model of this, I mean, think in terms of Switzerland. Do you see the Swiss government or the Swiss people angsting over who's elected president of Egypt, what the situation in Egypt's going to be? Do you see them angsting about the drugs in Latin America or the insurgency in Africa or you don't see them angsting about any of that, right? I mean, they are totally set for defense. Nobody would dare invade Switzerland because they're entirely oriented to defending their country. Everybody's well armed. Everybody knows how to shoot a gun. They're armed to the teeth, and their defense fortifications have been built up over decades. So the only thing they're concerned about is, hey, don't invade us. Don't even think about invading us. But they don't get involved in the world in terms of sending their troops over to establish military bases in Latin America. In other words, their foreign policy is essentially the foreign policy of the U.S. government for the entire founding period, for more than 100 years. We didn't have this empire, this national security state, this CIA, regime change operations, coups, assassinations. We got to get our people in public office. Oh my gosh, who are we going to support in Egypt? Who are we going to support in Jordan? None of that. In other words, the U.S. government would restore, under a libertarian principle, restore itself to a constitutional republic. No more military empire. Dismantle the military. Close all the bases, including Guantanamo, end all the sanctions, end the embargoes, liberate the private sector, the American people, to interact with the people of the world, trade, visit, tour. The world loves Americans. They just don't like the U.S. government. They don't like the U.S. empire. And so we would just dismantle all that, push all the troops into the private sector, dismantle the CIA, dismantle every welfare program. And notice I'm not talking about reform. Get rid of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. They've all been proven to be disastrous experiments. I mean, we experimented with socialism. Get rid of it. It hasn't worked. It's bankrupting our country. It's immoral. And so, under a libertarian paradigm, everybody keeps everything he earns. And he manages his own money. He manages his own life. His families plan out things. Healthcare costs they would just be reasonable costs, like going to the grocery store, like they were in the 1950s before Medicare and Medicaid were brought into existence. And so you would just be a regular expense. You decide, well, do I want insurance? Do I want to self-insure? And then people taking care of their own parents, the parents that are in need. I mean, a lot of parents are wealthy. They don't need Social Security. Others, hey, they got to keep working. And others, they're sick or they're destitute. They can't work anymore. Okay, that's what honoring mother and father are all about, not through the state. You think God cares about the welfare state? You think he's looking at American children and saying, oh, look how kind? And of course not, because it's evil. It's immoral to forcibly take money from one person and give it to another. So the libertarians, we believe in people, obviously. I mean, we don't want force involved in all this, and we leave people free to keep everything they earn. They decide what to do with it. They manage their retirement. They take responsibility for their choices. If they want to live for today and go out and just live like there was no tomorrow, that's their choice. It's no different from climbing a mountain. If they choose to ingest harmful substances, that's their choice. I mean, that's what life's all about. Except that you can't go out and steal or rob or kill anybody. I mean, that's where the state then does punish you. So the state would have a very limited role. And, oh, by the way, this is the key to a prosperous society. And this is what liberals just don't get. They think that when the government takes care of people, that's the secret to helping the poor. That's just nonsense. That's the worst thing you can do. It makes the poor dependent on the state. Makes them helpless. The best thing you could do is have a society in which the poor have a chance to become wealthy. I mean, that's the libertarian paradigm. Because under the libertarian paradigm, the rich, that we're all taught to revile, the rich covet what they have, take what they have, envy what they have. Well, no, in the libertarian paradigm, the rich actually benefit everybody. They go out and they buy the things that none of us can afford at first, like color television sets or new computers. They bring these things into existence because they can afford them, and so entrepreneurs can afford to invest in these things. And then over time, they start mass producing, and they become the necessities of the middle class. The rich, their savings produce capital, and it's through capital that people are made more productive. More production means higher wages, and therefore, more prosperity. So this notion that there's this conflict between the poor and the wealthy, that's just nonsense. God doesn't create a society like that. Instead, there's a harmony, a natural harmony of interests. It is in the interest of the poor that a lot of people are becoming wealthy, not through the state, not through coercion, but through the market economy, by producing goods and services that other people want. I mean, look at Bill Gates. Okay, wealthy, right? Look what he's done for us. I mean, look what he's done to our standard of living. Not because he's necessarily a great guy and he was trying to help us out and whatever. Maybe he is and maybe he was. But let's just assume that all he wanted to do was become a billionaire. In order to do that, he served us. And so the wealthy are people that we should celebrate, not envy, not covet. I mean, those things are wrong to do. And so under a libertarian paradigm, you've got an unhampered market economy where the government's not controlling, interfering, regulating, and so forth. You've got people keeping everything they earn. They decide what to do with it, and manage their retirement, their charity decisions, their health care, their education, their food, their clothing, everything. And then you've got this massive rising level of prosperity where everybody's benefiting, including the destitute, because the more people have, the wealthy, the middle class, the more they're donating. And so this is why the libertarian paradigm is really the key. Not just because of the moral principle, but also because of the utilitarian principle. It's better for everyone else. Now, people say, pie in the sky, Jacob, pie in the sky. No, it's not. Because if the statists could bring their system into play here in the United States, if they could force that system on us, then we can oust it. And keep in mind that there was once a society that lived without Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the drug war, torture, assassination, empire, income taxation, paper money. That country was the United States. So it proves that you can have it. It's not just pie in the sky, it's real. And we just have to keep promoting this idea of economic liberty, because as more and more people discover it, and especially people in the younger generations, that's when we're going to overcome the statists and what they've done to our country and what they continue to do to our country. That's the show. Thanks for listening in, and I'll see you next week.